Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you this morning. Today you just heard that great story of the feeding of the 5,000. I know you're familiar with it, but you may not realize how unique this story is. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle in all four Gospels. What does that tell us? There must have been something so significant about that story that all four of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, included in their gospel. It must have been not only important to them, but to those who would hear it. So today we might ask ourselves, what does this story say to us? Well, we do hear from time to time that this is not a story of a miracle of loaves and fishes, but rather that it's a story of sharing, that the people who were there were so moved by Jesus' compassion that they shared whatever they had brought with them. Just one small problem with that interpretation. There isn't anything in the gospel that suggests that. That kind of interpretation is called eisegesis. So let's just get into the weeds just a little bit this morning, okay? Eisegesis, it sounds like Jesus is in that name, but it's spelled differently, okay? It's not part of the name. Eisegesis is when we inject into the story our own personal viewpoints, reading something into the story that maybe we want to be there, but isn't. And as you can imagine, that kind of interpretation is generally frowned upon. So instead of eisegesis, what we're called to do is to sit before the text and allow God to speak to us through those gospel writers and to hear what God might have us hear. And that's called exegesis, okay? Eisegesis bad, exegesis good. Got it? If you do, you're the smartest congregation in the Archdiocese of Louisville. So let's try a little exegesis this morning, shall we? Now, if Jesus had told people to share what they had brought, that would have been a lovely story, a great example for us to share what we have with those in need, right? But listen what we hear in the gospel. When Jesus asked Philip, "How are we going to buy bread for all these people?" the gospel goes on to say, Jesus knew what he was going to do. And then he blessed or gave thanks, and the food was distributed to those present, and he fed 5,000 people. Remember when Father Leo Linghung was here some years ago? Anybody remember Father Leo, the cooking priest? Okay, a few of us have been around long enough. He gave us a great presentation, and he said something that stuck with me ever since. He said this: feeding someone is an act of love. Feeding someone is an act of love. Feeding someone is like saying, I want you to live. I want you to thrive. I want you to be healthy. Because without being fed, we can't be those things, can we? You know, when I've gone to Tanzania and Kenya or even Bangladesh, and I'm sure some of you have had this experience, the first thing that happens when you go visit someone, they must give you something to eat or drink. Has nothing to do with whether you're hungry or thirsty. It doesn't matter. It's not about what they have in their cupboard or don't have in their cupboard. It's about them showing their care and concern by feeding you. And so with the idea of Father Leo in mind, here comes Jesus, and he feeds 5,000. What a tremendous act of love. Well, in order to do a good exegesis, we need to take things in context. And the context of today's gospel is John chapter 6. And we read that the day after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus is again with the crowds. And he tells them this: you seek me not because you saw signs, but because I fed you. But don't labor for the food that perishes, for the but for the food which endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. And then he goes on, I am the bread of life, and the bread which I will give is life, for the life of the world is my flesh. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my bread and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. While feeding the 5,000 is truly a remarkable feat, Jesus seems to be saying that I've got something even better for you. Isn't it interesting that in Christianity we have a God who feeds us? And not just any food, not just loaves and fishes. Jesus came to offer his very life as food in the Eucharist. In the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus satisfied the physical hunger of that group of folks for one day. But in the Eucharist, he has something which satisfies the hunger of all humanity for all time. This meal isn't just for a few for one day, but for everyone. And there's more. We're fed not only in the Eucharist, that greatest of meals. Jesus feeds us in many other ways as well, doesn't he? With the joy of the gospel, with the mercy and hope of forgiveness, with the love and acceptance despite our failings. He feeds us by bringing meaning to our lives, by reminding us that we are children of God, and in so many other ways. And all this feeding is for a purpose. Because we are fed in so many ways by our God, we are called to feed others, aren't we? Not with the bread of bitterness, or the appetizer of anger, or the hors d'oeuvres of hostility. Shall I go on? I've got more. The soup of sarcasm, the wrath of radishes. Those things aren't food, they're poison. They don't bring life, they kill the soul. Jesus feeds us so that we can feed others with the things of God, which always bring life. Remember, feeding someone is an act of love. And as I was writing this homily, I couldn't help but think of the great generosity, the feeding that you all have done to the poor around the world. Medical care for a young girl in the slum of Kibera who has colon cancer. Monthly support for a newly ordained priest. New car tires for a priest in Morogoro, or funds for the construction of a new church. Tuition for a number of young people to get an education. Several water purification projects. Tuition for a young woman to get her teaching degree, and now she's become a nun as well. The house we built and the shop for the young woman who was abandoned and abused by her husband. The free dental care that Kathleen and Kevin Thompson have provided for many, many, many years. There's so many ways in which you've fed those around the world. Keep feeding. As a parish, we've also literally fed thousands through our meal packing program, through our participation in the soup kitchens and so on. Keep feeding. You've helped so many people you've never met. Just like the 5,000 that Jesus fed, most of whom I'm sure he never met as well. Keep feeding. We also feed each other with words of encouragement. I can't tell you how much it means to me to hear your words of encouragement, to have your care and concern, to enjoy your friendship. We feed each other by being kind, giving the benefit of the doubt, forgiving, and being gracious to one another. Feeding someone is an act of love. I'm sure you've heard it said by St. Augustine when he spoke about the Eucharist, and he said, "Become what you have received." And what we have received in the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ. And if Jesus was the love of God in human form, then to become what we've received is for us to become the love of God in human form. And if Jesus was all about feeding us, shouldn't we feed each other? Who are you going to feed today?